Hello, class. Last time we talked about why we should study theology. Today, what we want to talk about is how we study theology. What are the tools? What are the starting points? What are the foundations for the theological task? So today's lecture is called Foundations for the Theological Task. We want to start with the Wesleyan quadrilateral. This is the starting point of theological reflection. We have 4 points in the Wesleyan quadrilateral, and I want to show those to you briefly on the board. If I can get the marker to work here. We have Scripture, we have reason, and I hope y'all can see that. We have experience, and we have tradition. And that marker is dying. Tradition. So, we have these 4 aspects that come into play when we're doing theological reflection. The question is, which one is going to be your starting point? Which one is going to be foundational? In Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, tradition and Scripture together are of equal authority. And oftentimes, how that plays out in the real world is tradition trumps Scripture, because tradition is seen as the authoritative interpretation of Scripture. In more experiential expressions of Christianity, in Pentecostal and holiness movements, experience oftentimes becomes the standard by which things are measured. And so Scripture is interpreted in light of one's experience. In philosophical theology, reason is given the primary place. And so reason guides and determines the ordering of the rest of these and how things play out. But in traditional Protestant theology, going back to the Reformation, the norming standard has always been Scripture. Start with Scripture and interpret your experience in light of Scripture. Assess the value of tradition in light of Scripture. It's not that we do away with tradition, but we assess tradition in light of Scripture. Scripture and reason have to work together in this vein. Reason is not allowed to trump and override Scripture. And so the biblical starting point is this. The Reformers had a phrase, sola scriptura, the Bible alone. They also had another Latin phrase, norma normans non normata. That means the norming norm that has no norms. Scripture was that norming norm. Scripture was the norm for everything else. So how does Scripture then and reason interact? God does not expect you to sacrifice your intellect for the sake of faith. In Matthew, Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." God does not expect us to sacrifice our intellect for the sake of faith. But we must recognize sin's effects on our ability to reason and our ability to think. We don't think as we should. Paul says in Romans that our minds are clouded and darkened by sin. We need to recognize that as creatures, we are finite and God is infinite. So there are limits to what we can do and how we can think. And so reason must stand subject to divine revelation, yet it does not abdicate its role of seeking understanding or solving problems. Reason then seeks to organize and make defensible our system of beliefs. In this model, then, what is the relationship between experience and Scripture? Well, first of all, biblical Christianity is experiential. You cannot deny the experience aspect of biblical Christianity. But biblical Christianity judges the experience in light of Scripture and not vice versa. In other words, we don't say, I had this experience and so this text must mean this. we go to the text and ask it to evaluate our experience to see if this was a valid experience of God's work, or if this was a self-delusion or a spiritual delusion. There is always a danger of eisegesis in relating experience to Scripture, of reading into Scripture what we want to find there based on our experience. But experience gives life to the expression of our faith, and so we don't want to throw out experience, but we want to judge experience against Scripture. Where does tradition fit in then in this model? Tradition is not excluded by Scripture, but tradition must be judged by Scripture. Tradition, therefore, gives historical roots to our Christian identity, but that doesn't mean that everything we find in the tradition of the church has to be embraced as true. We must evaluate it and weigh it against the Scriptures, and this is what the Reformers sought to do with the traditions of the medieval church. The theological task then and the Bible are things to consider, and I would refer you to a book entitled The Fabric of Theology by Lintz, L-I-N-T-S. Lintz says, begin with the Bible. Isaiah 8:20 says, to the law and to the testimony, if they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. So we begin with the Bible. That's our starting point. And then there are three horizons of redemptive interpretation as we wrestle with the text. There's the textual horizon. There's the redemptive purpose of revelation. What is the redemptive purpose of this text? There is the epochal horizon, which deals with the progressive nature of revelation. We have a less developed view of the afterlife in the Old Testament than we do in the New Testament. It's part of progressive revelation. We have some things in the Old Testament that people today find highly disturbing that are addressed differently in the New Testament. That is a matter of progressive revelation. And so God making himself known in stages at different points in the text, we have to take that into account as we interpret the text. And then the canonical horizon deals with the promise and the fulfillment. The Bible gives us promises, but it also shows us certain degrees of fulfillment, especially with regard to the first coming of Christ. So we must look at promise and fulfillment.